I'm 32 now, and I have a younger brother, Noah, who's 27. Growing up, most of our lives were shaped by Mom. Dad was rarely around, always out doing his important work, but looking back, it feels like he was just choosing his job over us. I don't remember him much at home, except for occasional weekends, and even then, we never had any of those typical father-son bonding moments. Dad missed out on all the little milestones, my first soccer game, school award ceremonies, even the time I broke my arm and ended up in the ER. It was always Mom handling things, while Dad stayed at a distance. But things changed when Noah was born. Suddenly, it was like Dad flipped a switch, and he was a hands-on, doting father. He'd go to all of Noah's school events, cheer at his soccer games, and even do the little things, like helping him with Cub Scouts. The man who never had time for me was suddenly a super dad for my brother. I don't blame Noah. He didn't ask to be the golden child, but watching it happen messed with my head. I was this kid who'd spent years hoping for Dad's attention, and Noah just got it without even trying. Dad and I were like strangers half the time, but he'd light up whenever Noah walked in, as if Noah were some mini version of himself. And it wasn't just me who noticed. Mom could see it too. She tried to keep things fair between us, never playing favorites. In fact, I think she made an extra effort with me to make up for Dad's fixation on Noah. We'd have our own quiet moments. Reading together, baking, doing puzzles, simple, meaningful stuff. She used to tell me, "You don't have to be like your dad to be amazing." Those words stuck with me, and I think they're what kept me going when it felt like I was invisible to him. As I got older, I tried to win Dad over a few times. I'd try to talk to him about things I liked, hoping he'd take an interest, but he'd just look at me, puzzled, as if I were speaking a foreign language. Eventually, I gave up, figuring if he wanted a connection, he'd have to put in some effort too. Spoiler, he never did. Noah, on the other hand, was exactly the kind of son Dad wanted. Into sports, not afraid to get his hands dirty, with the same stubborn streak that Dad seemed to love. They'd spend hours together, fishing, playing catch, going on camping trips, whatever they wanted to do. Meanwhile, I'd be in my room, either reading or tinkering on my computer. They'd be outside playing football while I stayed inside with my projects. I'd see Dad's disappointed look when he'd see me with my head buried in a book or on the computer. He didn't even need to say anything. It was obvious he wished I was more like Noah. Honestly, I think he saw me as Mom's kid, and Noah as his. Mom was the one who handled everything for me. School events, hospital trips, homework, you name it. When he was around, Dad just did his own thing, offering up fatherly advice that didn't mean much since he didn't actually know me. Half the time, it felt like he didn't even try. When Noah got older and started joining sports teams, it was like Dad took on a second job as his personal coach. They'd come home from games all hyped up, telling me about Noah's amazing play, or how he'd been the MVP. I'd sit there, nodding politely, while Dad would just go on like I wasn't even part of the conversation. I didn't need a big pat on the back or anything, but it would have been nice if he'd asked about my day once in a while. By that point, I'd given up on expecting anything from Dad. I figured that maybe, as I got older, things would change. Maybe he'd come around and realize that just because I wasn't like him, didn't mean I was worthless. But no, he'd make little comments like, "A real man isn't afraid to get his hands dirty," or, "Why don't you join a team?" It was like I'd never be enough for him just as I was. Mom was the opposite. She'd sit and listen to me talk about the books I was reading or hang out with me while I worked on tech projects, and she'd actually pay attention. She'd tell me she was proud of me, and that was all I needed. Looking back, I think she knew Dad wasn't going to step up, and so she doubled down on supporting me. She never made me feel like I needed to be someone else to be valuable, and without her, I don't think I would have had the confidence to go after my dreams. But then when I was 13, Mom passed away. It felt like my world had collapsed. The one person who'd always been there for me, who understood me, was gone. After she died, Dad seemed to grow even closer to Noah, while I faded into the background even more. Losing Mom was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through, and I had no one left in the house who actually got me. I was adrift, feeling more alone than ever, while Dad and Noah carried on like nothing had changed. I think people expect families to come together when tragedy strikes, but that's not how it went for us. Instead of finding support in each other, Dad and Noah just seemed to get closer, while I became more of an afterthought. They acted like losing Mom wasn't that big of a deal, while I was left trying to process the loss all on my own. One day, a few months after Mom passed, I came home from school after a rough day. Kids giving me condolences, teachers looking at me with pity. I just wanted to come home and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But when I walked in, there was Dad with Noah laughing at something on the TV like everything was fine. I felt like a ghost in my own home. I started spending a lot more time in my room after that. It just hurt too much to be around them, watching them bond while I grieved alone. I'd be in the kitchen making a snack, and they'd come in, talking about Noah's latest game or whatever they'd done together, barely glancing my way. I'd try to join the conversation sometimes, but Dad would just give me this look that seemed to say, "Why are you even talking?" Eventually I gave up. With no one to turn to, I threw myself into tech, coding specifically. It started as a distraction, but the more I got into it, the more I realized I was actually good at it. I'd spend hours teaching myself new things, working on projects, and building simple websites. Every small success felt like a win. It was something that didn't rely on anyone else's approval, and for a while, it was enough. Of course, Dad didn't see it that way. To him, I was wasting time on the computer. He'd make snide comments like, "When are you going to do something useful?" Or, "Real men don't hide behind a screen." I just nodded and kept working. I'd learned by then that arguing with him was pointless. If he couldn't understand it, he just dismissed it. But then one day, I finally made something that I was genuinely proud of. I'd spent weeks building a simple program that could help with basic tasks. It was small, but it worked, and I wanted to show someone. My first instinct was to show Dad, hoping that maybe, for once, he'd see the effort I'd put in and actually care. I remember the moment I showed Dad my program. I'd put so much work into it, and a part of me thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd see how much it meant to me. But when I explained how it worked, he barely looked at the screen. All I got was a flat, "That's nice," before he turned back to whatever he'd been doing. That single moment hit me harder than I'd ever expected. I realized right then that no matter what I did, he was never going to care about my achievements. He was too busy building this dream of Noah, his perfect son, to even notice my efforts. From that point on, I stopped trying. I figured I'd just do my own thing, and if Dad ever wanted to reach out, he'd have to make the effort. But surprise, he didn't. It was just easier for him to keep things as they were, focused on Noah's sports and grades while I faded into the background. And honestly, once I stopped trying, things got a little easier. I came home, went straight to my room, and threw myself into coding. I started taking on small tech gigs to make some extra money, fixing computers, building websites, troubleshooting. Anything to keep me busy and give me a sense of control. It wasn't much, but for the first time, I felt like I was working towards something while Noah was thriving. He was the star player on his soccer team, getting recognition left and right, and Dad was there for every moment of it. Family gatherings were all about Noah's games and achievements, while I got the usual, "Oh, and you're still doing that computer stuff, right?" It stung, but I learned to just nod, figuring there was no point in trying to make them understand. By the time high school was coming to an end, I knew what I wanted: to go to college for computer science. Coding had become more than just a hobby. It was my future. I started applying to schools with strong tech programs and even landed a summer internship at a local startup to get real experience. For once, I felt like I was on a path that actually mattered, one that I could call my own. But then came the issue of paying for college. I'd worked hard to get scholarships, but there was still a significant gap. I didn't have the savings to cover it, so I did the only thing I could. I sat Dad down and laid out my plans, hoping he'd finally understand how serious I was about this. When I finished explaining, he just sighed and said, "I don't think it's worth spending all that money on something so unpredictable." He threw in some line about stability and real jobs, and all I could do was sit there, stunned. This was coming from the same man who'd easily spent money on gear and training for Noah's sports, no questions asked. My brother got everything he needed, but when it came to my education, my future, it was too much of an investment. I tried to reason with him, showed him my scholarship letters, even explained about the internship I'd lined up. But he shook his head and told me, Your brother's struggling with his grades right now. He needs our support. You can figure this out on your own." Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. It was clear he'd never understand what my goals meant to me. He wasn't going to help, and honestly, it wasn't even about the money. It was that he didn't see tech as something real, something worth investing in. After that, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay in a house where I felt like an outsider in my own family. I reached out to my Aunt Sarah, Mom's older sister, and she immediately offered me a place to stay. Moving in with her wasn't easy. It meant switching schools, leaving behind the few friends I had, and starting over in a different part of town. But at least there, I felt like I mattered. When I told her about my college plans, she did something that shocked me. Despite living paycheck to paycheck, Aunt Sarah offered to help cover my tuition. She even asked some of her close friends to pitch in, and somehow they made it happen. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough to get me started. Sitting in her small, cluttered kitchen, going over finances, looking at checks from people who barely knew me, it was one of the most humbling moments of my life. From that moment on, I promised myself I'd make every dollar count. I wouldn't let their faith in me go to waste. College was surreal. Finally, I was studying what I loved. I poured everything into my classes, picked up every skill I could, and started building a small portfolio of projects. My professors were supportive, and the environment felt like a place I belonged for the first time. I worked hard, and it started to pay off. My grades were strong, and I was able to land small tech gigs here and there to make some extra cash. During college, I started working on an idea I'd been toying with for a while, a project I thought could make a real difference in the tech space. Between classes, assignments, and part-time jobs, I poured every spare moment into it. It was exhausting, but I felt like I was building something meaningful, something that was mine. And through it all, Aunt Sarah was there, cheering me on. Even if she didn't fully understand the tech jargon, she was interested. She'd ask questions, genuinely wanting to know what I was working on. Knowing I had her support meant everything to me. She was the only family member who believed in me, and just having her in my corner kept me going. Looking back, I'd like to say that this experience made me stronger, and maybe it did, but it also left a mark. I stopped expecting anything from Dad or Noah. I realized they were never going to be the kind of family that would support me, not in the way I needed. That hurt, and it made me angry, but it also pushed me to prove that I didn't need their approval to succeed. Over time, I saved up enough to start paying Aunt Sarah back bit by bit. I'd slip her an envelope every month with what I could, and she'd always say it wasn't necessary, that she was just happy to see me thriving. But I insisted. She'd given me a chance when no one else had, and I couldn't just let that go unappreciated. By the time I was approaching graduation, I had a working prototype for my app. I didn't tell anyone in my family except Aunt Sarah. She didn't fully understand what I'd created, but she was thrilled for me nonetheless. It felt incredible to have someone be proud of my achievements without any strings attached. I felt like I was finally proving to myself that I could make something of my own. After graduation, I decided to go all in on my app. It was a risk, but I felt like I finally had something that could make an impact. I was a nobody in the industry, but I'd put in so much work that I figured there was no harm in taking it to the next level. If it failed, I'd find a way to pick myself up. If it succeeded, well, I didn't know what that would look like yet, but I was ready to find out. I started small, pitching my app to local businesses. Most didn't bite, and the rejections piled up, but I kept pushing forward, improving the app and learning from every piece of feedback. It was tough, but persistence began paying off in ways I hadn't expected. A few people started using it, spreading the word, and before long, companies were reaching out to me. There was one moment that stood out above the rest. Late one night, I was working when I got an email from a bigger tech company. Not a massive name, but big enough that they could give me a serious boost. I must have read that email 100 times, not believing it was real. They wanted a meeting, and they wanted it soon. Sitting there in my tiny apartment, staring at the screen, I realized that things were finally going my way. All those years of hearing Dad say, "Tech isn't a real career," or "It's just a hobby," no longer hurt. I didn't need anyone's approval anymore. I was doing this for me. That meeting with the tech company turned out to be my first big break. I was nervous. trying to hide the excitement and nerves bubbling up inside me. I went in, showed them what my app could do, explained how it solved specific problems they'd been facing, and did my best to keep my voice steady. The guy running the meeting leaned back, looked at me thoughtfully, and finally said, "I think we can work something out." I had to fight the urge to grin from ear to ear. This deal wasn't going to make me a millionaire overnight, but it was big enough to boost my credibility and put my app in front of more people. From there, everything changed. Word began spreading about my app, and suddenly more companies wanted to work with me. I was juggling more projects than I'd ever expected, and the money, while not crazy at first, was enough to pay off some student loans, help Aunt Sarah with her bills, and move into a decent apartment. No more worrying about leaky pipes or broken windows. For the first time in my life, I felt stable. Looking back, it's almost funny. The kid who was told that his dreams were just a waste of time was finally building something meaningful. And it wasn't thanks to my family, it was in spite of them. That made the success feel even more satisfying. Graduation passed in a blur of excitement, relief, and pride. I'd come a long way from that kid hiding in his room to avoid Dad's disapproving looks. Now, I had a fully functional app, clients who respected me, and a growing reputation in my field. I told Aunt Sarah about every milestone, every little success, and each time, she was thrilled. She didn't fully understand the tech behind it, but her "I'm proud of you" was enough to keep me going. After graduation, I decided to focus on growing my app and making it the best it could be. I started small, reinvesting what I earned into better equipment and hiring a couple of freelancers to help expand its capabilities. It was a leap of faith, but by then, I'd learned to trust my instincts. Bit by bit, it paid off, and soon I was making more money than I'd ever thought possible. The day I hit my first big financial milestone, I felt a strange mix of pride and emptiness. I wanted to celebrate, but most of my college friends had scattered across the country, and I was pretty much a lone wolf. Aunt Sarah was thrilled, though. She even threw a small get-together with a few of her friends who'd helped me through school. I could see she was beaming, and that meant everything to me. Still, a part of me wanted Dad and Noah to know what I'd accomplished. I hadn't spoken to them since I'd left home, and as far as I knew, they hadn't tried to reach out either. But deep down, I wanted them to see that I'd made something of myself without their help. I wanted them to see that their lack of support hadn't held me back. Still, I held back from reaching out. I knew that if I did, they might somehow twist it around, making it seem like I owed them something, or worse, downplay my achievements. So I stayed quiet and kept my distance, focusing on work and building my client list. As the months went by, my app gained traction, and I found myself in a position I'd never imagined. Financially stable, with opportunities to expand and invest in new projects, I was living a life I'd once thought was just a dream. It felt surreal, going from the kid who wasn't good enough to someone who could actually make a difference. I didn't need validation from my dad anymore, but that didn't mean the past hadn't left its marks. I still felt like the outsider, the one they'd written off. But I'd built my own path, created my own success, and if they didn't care, that was on them, not me. Then one evening, out of nowhere, Dad and Noah showed up at my office. No call, no message, just the two of them standing in the doorway like they'd been invited. I'd been working late and figured the knock on the door was either an employee or the cleaning crew. But when I opened it and saw them, I was stunned. It was like seeing ghosts. After all these years of silence, here they were, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I just stared at them. They waited awkwardly for me to invite them in, and finally, still processing, I stepped aside and let them into my office. They looked around, taking in the space. My office wasn't huge, but it was nice. I'd put it together with my own money, and it was a space I was proud of. There was a small lounge area where I usually met clients, and they sat down there looking out of place. After a few seconds of silence, Dad cleared his throat and said, "We heard about your success. Figured it was time we stopped by to check in." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, and I could tell he was uncomfortable, maybe even a little intimidated by the reality of what I'd accomplished. Noah sat there trying to play it cool, but I could tell he wasn't exactly thrilled to be there either. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just nodded and sat down across from them, keeping my face neutral. Inside, I was feeling a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, maybe even a bit of satisfaction that they were finally acknowledging what I'd done. But I kept my cool, waiting for them to say whatever they'd come to say. Dad started with some small talk, asking about the app and how business was going. It was surreal hearing him try to act interested, like he'd been supportive all along. I gave him short, polite answers, keeping the conversation as shallow as possible. I could see he was struggling to keep it going, and honestly, that gave me a small, petty sense of satisfaction. After all those years of him dismissing me, here he was, trying to play the proud dad. It didn't sit right, but at least it felt like things were coming full circle. Finally, after a few awkward minutes, Noah cut to the chase. "Look, we need your help," he said bluntly. Dad shot him a look, probably annoyed by his bluntness, but I appreciated the honesty. At least now we were getting to the real reason they were here. Noah looked down, fidgeting with his hands, and explained that things hadn't been going well for him. He was struggling to make ends meet, had racked up some debt, and Dad had been helping him out for a while. But things had gotten worse, and now they were hoping I'd be able to step in and lend a hand. I had to stop myself from laughing. After all the years of being ignored and treated like an afterthought, they were here, asking me for help. The audacity was unbelievable. I kept my face blank, listening while Dad tried to frame it like some sort of family crisis, as if it were my duty to step in. When they were done explaining, I leaned back, crossed my arms, and asked, "Why me? You guys haven't cared about me or my work for years. What makes you think I'd want to help now?" Dad shifted uncomfortably, trying to come up with a response. He mumbled something about family sticking together and forgiveness, but I wasn't buying it. All those years of him putting Noah first, dismissing my dreams, refusing to support my education, it all came rushing back. They hadn't come to make amends. They were here because they needed something. I laid it out calmly, explaining exactly how I felt. "You know, it's funny," I told them. "When I was struggling, you both acted like I didn't matter. When I needed support, you weren't there. But now that I'm successful, suddenly you remember I exist. I'm not some backup plan you can come to when things get rough." Dad tried to interrupt, saying it wasn't like that and that they'd always cared. Noah jumped in, talking about how hard things had been for him, but it all sounded like excuses. I'd spent years dealing with their indifference, and I wasn't about to let them guilt me into fixing their problems now. I took a deep breath and said, "I've worked too hard to get here without any help from either of you." Their faces fell. Dad looked like he'd been slapped, and Noah just stared at the floor, silent for once. I could see the realization setting in. They'd come expecting me to save the day, but I wasn't going to bail them out, not this time. They left shortly after that, Dad muttering something about thinking it over and family loyalty. I saw them out the door, watching as they walked away. I felt a strange combination of relief, anger, and peace. I'd spent so many years feeling like I had to prove myself to them, but now I realize I didn't need their approval. I'd made it on my own, and that was enough. After they left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the closed door, processing everything. I hadn't expected them to show up out of nowhere, and I definitely hadn't expected them to ask for help. A part of me still couldn't believe they'd walked in with such nerve, acting like they could just stroll back into my life because they needed something. Yet, as the shock and anger faded, a surprising sense of calm set in. All my life I'd been trying to prove myself, always feeling like I had to reach some invisible standard they'd set for me. Now I realized I didn't need them to see me for who I was. I'd finally found my worth on my own. I'd built something from the ground up, not for them but for me, and that was enough. Over the next few months, my app continued to grow, gaining more traction than I'd ever dreamed. I poured myself into expanding the business, and for the first time, I felt like I was creating a life that was fully mine, with no strings attached. My world was filled with new projects, new ideas, and even a few trusted friends I'd met along the way who believed in what I was doing. But Sarah remained my biggest cheerleader, always checking in and asking how things were going. Each time I shared a new milestone or achievement with her, she would light up, reminding me how far I'd come. I made sure to keep paying her back for the sacrifices she'd made, slipping her a little extra whenever I could. She'd always protest, saying it wasn't necessary, but I'd insist. She was the one person who'd believed in me from the start, and I wanted her to feel that appreciation. Life kept moving forward, and my successes kept piling up. I hit several new milestones, each one bringing me closer to the vision I'd had for myself since those early days of coding in my room. My app was finally stable, reaching more users than I'd ever thought possible, and I'd expanded into other projects, branching out into different areas of tech. And for once, I felt like I didn't have anything left to prove, not to myself, and definitely not to them. Then, one day, I got a message from Noah. He'd sent a short text saying he wanted to meet up and that he just wanted to talk. My first instinct was to ignore it. After all, it wasn't like we'd stayed in touch since he and Dad had come to my office. But something made me pause. A small part of me was curious, wondering if he'd realized anything from our last encounter, maybe seen things differently. So I agreed to meet. We decided on a quiet coffee shop in town, and when I walked in, I found him sitting there, looking as uncertain as I felt. I sat down, and we exchanged a few polite greetings. For a while we just sipped our coffee in silence, neither of us quite knowing where to start. Finally, he broke the silence. "I know things haven't been easy between us," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "And I know that I got a lot of things from Dad that you never did." I didn't respond right away. I just watched him, waiting to see where he was going with this. He looked down, almost embarrassed, and then continued. I think I was blind to a lot of it. Dad always told me I was his pride and joy, that I'd carry on his legacy, but he never really looked at what that did to you." He paused, letting out a shaky breath. "I guess I just never stopped to think about what it was like for you growing up." Hearing him say those words stirred something in me. Emotions I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. For so many years I'd carried that resentment, convinced he would never understand. And here he was, finally acknowledging it. "I won't lie," I said, my voice steady but calm. "Watching you and Dad bond like that while I was on the sidelines, it hurt, a lot. But you were a kid too, it wasn't your fault." I sighed, looking him in the eyes. "I didn't hate you, Noah. I just hated feeling invisible." He nodded, and for the first time I saw a glimpse of understanding. We talked for a long time about things we'd never addressed before. The pain of losing Mom, the differences in how we'd been treated, the years of built-up resentment. For once, there was no bitterness, no anger, just two brothers finally having a conversation that had been left unspoken for too long. Noah told me about his own struggles, things I'd never known. He'd felt the pressure of Dad's expectations weighing him down, always afraid of letting him down, always afraid of being anything less than perfect. The golden child role hadn't been as golden as I'd imagined it. And for the first time, I could see things from his perspective, realizing that he'd been carrying his own burdens all along. By the time we left that coffee shop, I felt like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had lifted. We'd never be the closest of brothers, and I didn't expect us to see each other every week. But there was a new respect between us, an understanding that had finally bridged the gap that had divided us for so long. As for Dad, we didn't discuss him much. Noah still had a complicated relationship with him, and I had long since accepted that my dad and I would never have the connection I'd once wanted. He'd never understood me, and maybe he never would. And strangely, that was okay. I didn't need his approval anymore. I didn't crave his validation. I'd built my own life, and that was all the closure I needed. Over time, Noah and I kept in touch, checking in occasionally. He respected my boundaries, and I respected his need to handle things in his own way. Our paths were different, but we'd found a way to support each other, even if it was from a distance. It wasn't the relationship I'd dreamed of, but it was real, and that was enough. Years later, as I look back on everything, I realized that my life turned out exactly as it was supposed to. Losing Mom had been the hardest experience of my life, and my relationship with Dad had left scars, but each of those things pushed me to find my own strength, my own path. Aunt Sarah had been my anchor, and coding had been my lifeline, guiding me to the life I'd always wanted. Now, my app has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. I've expanded into new ventures, made a name for myself in the industry, and even started a small scholarship fund in Mom's memory for kids like me who don't have family support. Every year, I meet those kids, listen to their stories, and help them get the education they deserve. It's a small way to honor the sacrifices Aunt Sarah and Mom made for me, and it keeps me grounded. The life I built wasn't what anyone expected. Not Dad, not Noah, maybe not even me, but it's my life, and it's one I'm proud of. And that's the greatest success I could have asked for, Dot. Looking back, I feel a quiet, steady peace. I don't need anyone's approval anymore. I've learned to be proud of myself and to accept that some relationships won't ever be perfect, and that's okay. I've made peace with the past, embraced the present, and look forward to whatever the future brings, knowing I've already come farther than I ever imagined.